Heinrich Himmler walks down a stone hallway lit by burning torches. His medieval robes brush against the ground as he reaches for the heavy wooden door in front of him. He pushes it open and walks into a circular room with an eternal flame burning in the middle. Sitting around the flame are his 12 knights. Himmler has created his own Camelot, and these are his Knights of the Round Table, except all the men are genocidal maniacs. Himmler takes his place around the eternal flame. Everyone waits in silence for the head of the SS to speak. Himmler truly believes himself to be the reincarnation of a 9th century medieval king who drove the Slavs across the river Elbe, named Henry the Fowler. Himmler is so deeply convinced of his own delusion that it's driven him to create a fantasy world in his newly acquired castle. This might seem like something out of a World War II thriller, but it's all too real. Himmler had acquired Wewelsburg Castle at the start of the war, and from the beginning he knew it would be the place he could make all of his crazy dreams come true. Himmler had his eye on Wewelsburg due to its relatively close location to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where the Germans defeated the Roman armies in 9 CE. His new castle was somewhat run down at the time of purchase, but that didn't stop the Nazi from signing a 100-year lease. Himmler had grand plans for Wewelsburg. Many were based around the education of Schutzstaffel troops and the indoctrination of young Aryans into the ways of the Nazi Party. But some of his other ideas were so crazy that even Adolf Hitler questioned Himmler's sanity from time to time. Himmler planned to recreate a medieval-style community based on King Arthur's Camelot, except his town would be full of members of the Aryan race. He started by having a giant moat encircle the three-sided Wewelsburg castle. The plaster that had been used to cover the walls was removed so the barren stones could give the fortress a more medieval feel. There was also a number of repairs that needed to be carried out to fix the damage from neglect and the wars of long ago. It should come as no surprise who was given the task of repairing Himmler's fantasy fortress. Jewish people from the nearby concentration camps of Niederhagen and Sachsenhausen were used as slave labor. During its refurbishment phase, men, women, and children wearing their striped concentration camp uniforms would work tirelessly to make Himmler's Camelot dream a reality. And during this project, many innocent people would die from overexertion and accidents during construction. Wewelsburg Castle would never be completely finished, since Himmler could only dedicate so much time to overseeing his dream project. Yet many people, including Hitler himself, did not know the extent to which Himmler's deep obsession with King Arthur and his legends went. This is why he had an actual round table constructed and appointed 12 SS Knights to sit around with him. It would have been here that Himmler and his Knights would discuss the murders of millions of innocent people. SS officials would debate which towns or cities needed to be decimated in order to make room for a German population to move in. Himmler and his Knights also discussed the mass genocide of anyone who did not fit the Aryan mold while meeting inside the walls of Wewelsburg. Basically, even though Himmler was trying to mimic King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, there was nothing chivalrous or heroic about what he was doing. He bastardized the Arthurian legends to allow him to live out his sick fantasy. And the worst part was Wewelsburg Castle and the medieval world that Himmler created within and around it was also used for brutal murders, occult rituals, and torture. Himmler thought of Wewelsburg Castle as being the epicenter for the mystic powers that the Nazis would eventually possess. Himmler, along with the rest of Nazi leadership, wanted to dismantle organized religion. The moral compass of Christianity made mass genocide hard to swallow for many people, so the Nazis' plan was to destroy the Christian church and replace it with an ideology where everyone worshipped the state. However, Himmler had other plans as well. The future religion that he and his Aryan followers from Wewelsburg Castle would obey was much darker. This new world religion would be embedded with mysticism and ingrained in occultism. His SS Knights of the Round Table would become spiritual leaders and priests, who would be some of the most powerful men in the world. During World War II, Himmler was already grooming his knights for such a role. Before major battles, SS leaders were recalled to the castle to be prepared spiritually for the engagement ahead. The SS Knights and the foot soldiers they commanded were given rings engraved with skulls and other occult symbols. In Himmler's future, anyone who wore such a ring would be identified as an elite member of the new religion. In fact, when an SS soldier died, their ring was brought back to Wewelsburg Castle, where it would be placed in a casket. It's estimated that around 11,500 Totenkopfring or Death Head's rings were created. Some speculate that the rings might have been buried in a mountain nearby Wewelsburg, but no one has yet discovered them. One of the most influential Arthurian legends Himmler sought to emulate was the quest to seek out the Holy Grail. And even though the Nazis' desire to acquire religious relics and mystical objects is depicted in many movies and television shows, there is actual truth to some of these fictitious tales. Himmler desperately wanted to collect as many sacred and mystical artifacts as possible to house in Wewelsburg Castle. He believed that by securing so many supernatural objects in his fortress, the site itself would become a mecca for the new Aryan race and all those who believed in the occult. This is why when Himmler and his SS knights met at the castle, they often discussed different expeditions to track down and retrieve sacred artifacts. One of those artifacts was obviously the Holy Grail. Himmler couldn't idolize King Arthur and not search for the Grail himself. He was so sure the knights would eventually find the Grail that he had a whole room prepared to house the Cup of Christ. It is slightly ironic that a man who wanted to dismantle Christianity would be hell-bent on finding the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, but Himmler probably believed the relic held immense power, and that housing it in his castle would only strengthen his connection to the occult. But it wasn't just Christian holy relics that Himmler sent his SS knights to find. He also ordered them to locate Thor's hammer and bring it back to Wewelsburg. If there was an object that possessed supernatural powers, Himmler wanted it, and he almost certainly believed that finding Thor's hammer would be of great benefit to the Third Reich. There are even records of Himmler telling his SS commanders to find all places in the northern Germanic Aryan cultural world where an understanding of the lightning bolt, the thunderbolt, Thor's hammer, or the flying or thrown hammer exists. Looking for sacred artifacts and religious relics was one thing, but some of the occult practices that might have occurred within the walls of Wewelsburg were so dark and twisted that even Hitler might have been shocked by them. The Nazis were not afraid of murdering, torturing, or experimenting on people in their concentration camps. The horrifying truth is that some of the most terrible torture in history was carried out by the Nazi Party. Most of the experiments were done in the name of science, when in reality they were just a way for the Nazis to expand their genocidal agenda. But in the crypts of Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler and his occultists might have been performing rituals that involved torture, mutilation, and sacrifices for no other reason than to harness the power of the occult. We can imagine what such a gruesome scene would look like. Deep within the castle were winding hallways and hidden rooms. Himmler and his Schutzstaffel knights would be dressed in medieval garb. The crypt they had all gathered in was illuminated by the eternal flame burning brightly in the middle of the room. As the SS
You love your stuff, because your stuff is amazing. But what if bad stuff happens to your stuff?
knights waited for the ceremony to begin, Himmler would read passages from different books on the occult. Everyone in the room would be of Aryan descent. That is, until the sacrificial victim was brought in. As the prisoner was led to the middle of the room, the Nazis began to chant. Sacred relics were produced to aid in the sacrifice. Himmler had sent his knights across the world in search of ritual items, and they returned with some that were claimed to be imbued with mystical powers. Heinrich Himmler produced a ceremonial knife from under his robes. The screams of the sacrificial victim filled the chamber, but beyond the thick stone walls of the castle, all was silent in the cold night air. Unfortunately, as Allied forces advanced, most of the documentation kept in Wewelsburg Castle was lost when Himmler had the fortress destroyed. However, new diaries belonging to Himmler have recently been discovered. Historians are working through the material and will be publishing their findings in the near future. It is unknown what is exactly contained within the diaries, but perhaps we'll learn more about the dark events that took place within the walls of Wewelsburg Castle. In an almost unthinkable scenario where the Nazis had won the war, Himmler had big plans for his Aryan Camelot. He would have bolstered the forces of his SS knights and increased expeditions to locate sacred objects. The extent to which Himmler invested some resources and his own time into creating the perfect Nazi version of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table and Camelot shows how deeply invested the man was in his medieval fantasy. It's not out of the realm of possibilities that if the Nazis had won, Himmler would have made Wewelsburg Castle his permanent home. It would have been there that the mecca of the occultist religion would be located. It's not clear how much Hitler actually knew about the goings-on at Wewelsburg, but there are some claims that he thought the whole thing was nuts. It's also not known how far Himmler would go to spread the Aryan race and his occultist religion across the world. If Himmler truly believed himself to be the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler, then he might have grown tired of answering to the Führer. Would Himmler have launched his own holy war against Adolf Hitler and the rest of the Nazi Party leadership so that he could be the new king of the Aryan world? It's unclear, but he most certainly had delusions of grandeur. Wewelsburg Castle was restored by the German government and created into a museum as a way to teach its citizens and the world the dangers that can come with following the ideologies of a genocidal dictator. This was done to help ensure that history does not repeat itself. Although the castle was severely damaged by explosions and anti-tank mines by the retreating Nazis, Wewelsburg has almost been completely rebuilt. Some artifacts from its time under Himmler's control did make it to the present day. In the castle, visitors can find pigskin chairs with the SS lightning bolts branded onto them, along with other Nazi artifacts. There are also swastikas and other Nazi symbols built into the vaulted ceilings and walls within the fortress. Much of the history of Wilhelmsburg and what went on there was lost when the Nazis destroyed it, but archaeologists and historians are still making discoveries. So in the future, we may learn even crazier things that happened at Heinrich Himmler's Castle of Death.